5-mile runs, a salt course.
It's a new management tool. I believe they call it management by terror. You're going to have to get fit.
Oh, give me a break. I'm the company wife. You'll be the one hurtling up ladders and jumping across ditches.
What are you going to be doing?
Cheering at the top of my voice.
Thanks a lot.
You don't have to thank me. I've always supported you in everything you do. Why should I stop now? Do you know something?
What?
I think I rather fancy a bit of cake now.
Come here.
With a George Gershwin soundtrack, dazzling black and white photography and a backdrop of New York, on BBC2 now there's Manhattan, Woody Allen's film about a comedy writer whose love life has got beyond a joke. On BBC1 Scotland in half an hour, Panorama examines the growing battles between conservationists and developers, asking how Britain's industrial needs can be met without damage to the environment. That's in half an hour. 10:10 is the time for Excess this week, looking at the play John Brown's Body by John McGrath, and comic strip heroes, and meeting the new rector of Glasgow University, Pat Kane. And Miami Vice is at 10:40. The squad have more crime to tackle. Advice Shop is the last programme this evening on BBC1 Scotland, and that's the evening ahead. This is BBC1 Scotland. Now at 9 o'clock, the news with Michael Burke.
South African police have killed 8 black demonstrators. They fired on a banned demonstration, wounding more than 300 people. And the Soviet army steps back in Lithuania as President Gorbachev calls for a peaceful solution there. Good evening. It's now known South African police killed at least 8 blacks and wounded 350 others when they opened fire on a protest march today. The demonstrators were complaining about poor housing and working conditions in the township of Sebokeng, south of Johannesburg. It was one of several townships in the Vaal Triangle where people had planned to march on the white town of Vereeniging to present their grievances.
The ANC and its banners may be legal now, but today's march itself was unauthorized, illegal. President de Klerk's liberalization, however dramatic, hasn't answered many basic grievances. Instead, it has raised expectations of instant change. So today's call from the townships of the Vaal Triangle was the same call from the same area which prompted nationwide unrest back in 1984. These people want all their living conditions improved now, and the local black council they boycott scrapped instantly as proof apartheid is dying. Many of the marchers were carrying sticks, and the police were determined to stop them getting out of the township towards the white town of Vereeniging. First, the police used tear gas, but the marchers regrouped. Then a long, tense standoff before a group of protesters advanced on police lines, and they opened fire with shotguns. All day, conflict continued. One eyewitness said at least 4 people were killed in the initial gunfire, reviving memories of the infamous Sharpeville shooting of 69 black protesters in this same area 30 years ago this month. Today, more than 300 people have been treated for their wounds as angry youths turned on local offices of the township council, seen as a symbol of continuing apartheid. But commercial property was destroyed too, a petrol station sacked by rioters. The shooting went on, and with only 2 weeks to go before the ANC and the government meet for the first talks about talks, the government looks to Nelson Mandela to stop all this. But in weekend speeches, the ANC leader again condemned fighting between rival black factions, particularly in Natal, but wouldn't condemn anti-government protest. Tonight, South Africa's Law and Order Minister is insisting the security forces are in control of the situation, although violence is spreading. But the government knows the ANC is determined to go right through constitutional negotiations, taking the risk of maintaining maximum pressure on the streets. Today has shown most forcefully how fragile the prospects for a peacefully negotiated end to apartheid still remain. President de Klerk insists there is no further excuse for violence, given his public commitment to negotiate full political rights for the black majority. But that commitment, however radical to white South Africa, on its own cannot address the immediate grievances of black South Africa. James Robbins, BBC News in the Vaal Triangle.
The Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev has said he won't use force in Lithuania unless lives are threatened. The Lithuanians had been afraid the army would move against their parliament. After talks today with Soviet army officers, the Republic's government said there'd been a breakthrough in relations with Moscow, and it didn't expect the confrontation to be stepped up. But in the capital, Vilnius, Soviet troops have refused to leave public buildings.
Today, Soviet troops are still occupying Communist Party buildings. This one used to be the Institute of Marxism-Leninism, until the new Lithuanian government turned it over to the university here instead. But the angry communist hardliners were determined to seize it back, and so the soldiers went in on their behalf. Students are outraged, but they cannot resist.
We have no guns, you see. We are students, and we have studies of ancient philosophy, students of psychology, and we have no guns.
This is another party building now under army control, but fears that the Lithuanian parliament itself would be next on the list have receded. Last night, senior military officers were summoned by the Republic's leadership to explain why buildings in the capital had been taken over. Our camera allowed access to this tense and critical meeting. The result was a breakthrough, announced at a news conference immediately afterwards by President Vytautas Landsbergis. The soldiers and the politicians had agreed to meet on a regular basis, and their first talks were today. The aim to reduce tension, avoid misunderstanding and possible conflict. The new Lithuanian government are clearly pleased and relieved that they've now been able to open a dialogue with the Soviet military command here, and they're hopeful it might pave the way to full negotiations with Moscow. After today's meeting, the Lithuanian government said that the most dangerous moment for the Republic had passed, that the military had taken one step back. Emotions here are still intense, though. This angry protest today by members of the Russian minority, fiercely opposed to an independent Lithuania. And this evening, an army helicopter flew over Vilnius, scattering Communist Party leaflets that call for a demonstration tomorrow against the new government. Ben Brown, BBC News, Lithuania.
Washington has warned President Gorbachev that Soviet military action against Lithuania could harm relations between the superpowers. The State Department described the military occupation of public buildings in Vilnius as a form of intimidation. President Gorbachev discussed the crisis in Lithuania when he met Senator Edward Kennedy in Moscow today.
It was Mr. Gorbachev's first comment on the prospects for military intervention, telling Edward Kennedy that force would not be used unless lives were endangered. A different emphasis from the Kremlin's assurances up to now that force was categorically ruled out. And with the Soviet media portraying an essentially political revolt as something akin to the uncontrolled violence of Azerbaijan, the psychological ground has been prepared for a crackdown. The Soviet troops pouring into Lithuania are not there solely to save Mr. Gorbachev's face. There are military installations on the Baltic coast vital to Soviet security, which conservative opinion is pressing him to defend.
There must be some sort of guarantees of their neutrality, and I think military bases of the Soviet Union should be maintained near the Baltic coast to defend the strategic interests of the Soviet Union.
There is strong pressure for a crackdown, and Mr. Gorbachev himself has been talking tough. But with the whole future of his reforms at stake, he desperately needs the negotiations beginning today to produce a face-saving compromise. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
Here, one of the biggest teaching unions has voted to strike for the day on Wednesday week. The National Association of Schoolmasters and Union of Women Teachers wants a bigger pay offer and changes in government education policy. The union represents more than a quarter of teachers at schools in England, Wales and Northern Ireland.
Right, it's going to ask you now where you want to move it to.
For Will Warner, anything achieved by his union's one-day strike will come too late. After 10 years teaching, he's leaving the profession at Easter. As a head of computer studies, he earns around £17,000. His pay prospects are brighter in industry. On a 60% turnout, just under 62% supported the strike, which could close those schools where the union has the majority of members.
Of course we're concerned about the effect on children, and I will argue that's one of the chief reasons why we are having the strike at all. It will serve no purpose at all if people who are directly involved in education stand on the sidelines and wash their hands and wait for the catastrophe to occur. We wish to prevent the catastrophe, and by having our strike action, we think we are making a significant move towards that end.
After the last bout of strikes some 3 years ago, the government removed teachers' pay negotiating rights. The last two imposed pay awards, say the union, have amounted to a real terms pay cut. But the Education Secretary has condemned the strike.
Frankly, a day of action is an irrelevance, but it's worse than that. It's not good for the children and it's not good for the teaching profession.
The other teachers' unions oppose the strike. They believe growing awareness of teacher shortages has already won public support for better pay. The cross-party Commons Committee looking into teacher shortages is expected to share this view, and the government, aware of the scale of the problem, has just agreed a £2 million contract with Saatchi & Saatchi for a recruitment campaign this spring.
In Hungary's first free elections in over 40 years, voters have given overwhelming support to centre and right-wing groups. The ruling Socialist Party, formerly the Communists, took fourth place. But the formation of a new government still depends on a second round of voting.
Tonight in Budapest, the outcome of the first round of the election is at last clear after a day of confusion. The results were delayed for hours when the computers went on the blink. When the final figures did appear, it was the Democratic Forum who emerged on top, closely followed by the Free Democrats. Although the distribution could change in round two, the shape of Hungary's first truly democratic parliament is now clear.
When Hungary's 400 new MPs meet here in Parliament for the first time, there'll be an overwhelming majority for the Conservative and Centre parties who will sit here on the right. And the Communists, who'll probably have less than 40 seats, will be consigned to the unfamiliar role of opposition over on the far left.
Joseph Antal, the Forum's leader, is hoping to become Prime Minister. He's a former schoolmaster and has a distinct lack of charisma. Today he said he would try to form a coalition without the rival Free Democrats, although the arithmetic makes that unlikely. The first problem the new government will face is Hungary's role in the Warsaw Pact. Soviet troops have already started to pull out, but the Forum wants them to leave faster. And tonight Mr. Antal said he'd like to leave the Warsaw Pact altogether.
Természetesen Magyarországnak csak az lehet a célja,
Naturally, the only objective of Hungary could be
kilépjen a Varsói Paktumból.
to leave the Warsaw Treaty Organization.
Last week the Forum broke up a red star to remind voters it was the first big party to oppose the Communists. It's promised to privatise most of Hungary's state-owned business, although more slowly than the Free